Hi guys.
She was born in the 1910s when the world still believed that a girl's future could be neatly folded and stored in a drawer marked suitable. Her parents lived in a small house near the coast where the sea didn't roar so much as sigh long, slow breaths against the shingle. Most people in the town measured their lives by tides and fishing seasons. Dreams were practical things: a steady job, a warm kitchen, children who didn't wander too far. But from the beginning, she wasn't interested in staying close. When she was 5, she found a smooth black stone on the beach and asked her father what it was. He said, "Just a bit of rock, love. Toss it back." She didn't. She kept it in her pocket for weeks, then added another and another until her coat was heavy with them. She lined them up on the windowsill, sorted by colour, shape, weight. Her mother called it a phase. The neighbours said she was odd. One old woman told her, "You'll never catch a husband with a pocket full of gravel." She looked at the woman, then at her stones, and decided that catching husbands was less interesting than knowing where rocks came from. At school, she liked maps, not the ones showing cities and roads, but the ones with squiggly lines and numbers, contour lines, though she didn't know the word yet. She would stare at them for hours, imagining hills rising and falling beneath her feet. The teacher once caught her redrawing a map of Europe during arithmetic. "Why are you wasting time on that?" the teacher asked. "It's already been made," she said. "I wanted to see if I could do it better." The teacher wasn't amused. She was sent to the corner with a dictionary and told to look up obedience. She looked up geography instead. Her father wasn't a clever man, not in the way books measure cleverness. He worked in a warehouse, came home tired, and rarely spoke much at dinner. But he noticed things. He saw how she looked at the cliffs when they walked by the sea, how she picked up broken shells and turned them over like puzzles. One birthday, he gave her a book, A Child's Guide to the Earth. It was old, the cover peeling, probably bought for a few pence at a market. Inside were pictures of volcanoes, glaciers, and the layers of the planet, like a cake no one could eat. She read it until the pages fell out. The world around her didn't encourage curiosity, especially not in girls. At church, the vicar said women were made to guide, not to lead. At the library, the assistant raised an eyebrow when she asked for books on rocks. "Are you sure you don't want something lighter? A novel, perhaps?" she said. "This is light enough. It doesn't weigh more than a brick." The woman didn't laugh, but she handed over the book. She didn't set out to change science. She just didn't see why the rules should apply to her. When her classmates giggled about boys and hair ribbons, she doodled cross-sections of mountains in the margins of her notebook. When her aunt said, "You'll grow out of this nonsense," she replied, "I hope not. I'm not very good at gardening." There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet certainty that she was built for something else. One day, during a school trip to a quarry, the teacher warned the children not to wander off. "The ground isn't safe," he said. "It could collapse." She looked down and saw layers in the rock face, stripes of grey, brown and rust, like pages in a book that had been slammed shut. While the others threw pebbles into the water below, she crouched and touched the stone. It was cold, rough, real. She thought, "This has been here longer than people, longer than houses, longer than rules." No one noticed her that day, but she noticed everything. Later, she would be told that women couldn't lead expeditions, couldn't interpret sonar, couldn't possibly understand the deep ocean. Men would say these things with the confidence of men who had never spent an afternoon talking to a cliff. But she had already learned the most important lesson, that the earth didn't care about titles or gender, or who had a degree and who didn't. It just was. And if you were quiet enough, patient enough, it would tell you things. Even then, as a child with muddy shoes and a head full of questions, she understood one thing better than most adults ever would. That discovery doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it begins with a girl, a rock, and the simple refusal to throw it back. And if someone had told her then that one day her name would be mentioned, quietly, reluctantly, often without credit, in the same breath as the greatest scientific breakthroughs of the century, she might have smiled. Or not. She wasn't one for drama. She'd probably just have gone back to her stones. University was a grey stone building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated joy. It stood at the edge of a town that smelled of rain and old books, and it welcomed her with a notice on the door. No admittance for women in the geology lecture hall without prior approval. She knocked anyway. The man who answered wore a tie that hadn't been fashionable since the war, and a look that said he'd been expecting trouble. She told him her name, and that she'd been accepted, barely, after a letter from her head mistress calling her determined, if misguided. He checked a list, sighed as if personally wronged, and let her in, muttering something about setting a bad precedent. The lecture hall was full. Rows of men in dark jackets, pens at the ready, hair neatly combed as if seriousness could be measured by parting. She took a seat in the front, the only woman in sight. A few turned to look. One dropped his notebook. Another whispered something that made his friend snort into his elbow. She didn't flinch. She opened her book, placed her pencil carefully on the page, and waited. The professor arrived late, as if to prove he was important, and began speaking about igneous rocks as though they were the most thrilling thing in the world. She listened. She took notes. She underlined things. After the first week, a rumour started. The girl in the front row had corrected the professor. It wasn't true, not exactly. What happened was, he'd pointed to a diagram of a volcano and said the lava came from the Earth's core. She'd raised her hand and said, "Isn't it from the mantle?" He'd paused, blinked, then said, "Well, yes, technically," and moved on. But by lunchtime, the story had changed. Now she'd shouted at him. Now she'd challenged his entire career. Now she was dangerous. She didn't care. She kept coming. She studied in the library when it was too cold to stay in her rented room. She borrowed books no one else wanted. The physical structure of the ocean crust, seismic waves in sedimentary layers, and read them by candlelight. The other students formed groups, met in pubs, talked over pints about fieldwork and fossils. She worked alone. When invited once, "Come on, even girls need a break," she went. They sat at a table, laughing too loudly, and someone said, "So what's a clever girl like you doing in geology? Planning to marry a professor?" She looked at him and said, "I was planning to drink my lemonade, but thanks for the career advice." They didn't invite her again. Field trips were worse. The department allowed her to attend, but only if she stayed behind the group. Only if she didn't touch the rocks unless given permission. Only if she didn't disturb the natural workflow. On one trip to the Welsh hills, it rained for 3 days straight. The men huddled under tarps, complaining about their boots. She walked ahead, collecting samples, her coat soaked, her hands numb. When she pointed out a fault line in the rock face, clear as a crack in a window, the group leader said, "Very observant, now go and make tea." She didn't argue. She made the tea. Then she wrote down everything she'd seen, in her own notebook, in her own words. One evening, after a particularly dull lecture on mineral classification, a senior student stopped her in the corridor. He was tall, confident, the kind of man who believed his voice carried authority just by existing. "You know," he said, "most people think women lack the spatial reasoning for geology. It's not personal." She looked at him. "Right. And I suppose men have a natural gift for it, like dogs do for fetching sticks?" He frowned. "That's not what I—" She cut in. "If you're trying to tell me I don't belong, just say it. Saves time." He didn't reply. He walked away, possibly in search of someone easier to patronize. Still, she passed her exams. Not just passed, topped the year. The results were posted on a board outside the department office. A crowd gathered. Someone said, "No, that can't be right." Another said, "She must have cheated." A professor, one of the few who hadn't openly mocked her, looked at the list and said quietly, "Well, That's awkward. Her name was first. No asterisk. No note saying, female candidate. Just her name, bold and plain. No one congratulated her. No one offered to celebrate. But the next lecture, the professor paused before speaking and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to note that someone in this room scored higher than any student in the past 10 years. Let that be a reminder that effort matters more than opinion." He didn't look at her, but he didn't have to. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and a little sad, not for herself, but for the world that had to be dragged, kicking and muttering, into basic fairness. Still, she kept going. She wrote her thesis on underwater geological formations, something no one had studied properly, mostly because no one could see them. Her supervisor read it and said, "Interesting. But how can you map what you can't observe?" She said, "Same way you learn about anything you've never seen. You look at the evidence and stop pretending it's not there." He gave her a mark, but not a compliment. Graduation day came and went. She stood in line with the others, in a gown too big for her, listening to speeches about progress and tradition. No one mentioned her by name. No one pointed her out. When it was over, she walked back to her room, took off the gown, and packed her books. She had a degree. It didn't change how the world saw her. But it was a tool, and she had learned by now that tools didn't need applause. They just needed to be used. Later, she would realise that university hadn't taught her geology so much as it had taught her patience. The patience to be ignored. The patience to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The patience to believe in something simply because the numbers said it was true, even when every man in the room said it wasn't. And if anyone had told her then that one day people would call her stubborn, she would have agreed, but she'd have added, quietly, that being stubborn was the only thing that kept her from giving up, or throwing a rock at someone's head. She wasn't violent, but the thought had crossed her mind. After graduation, she found herself in a room full of filing cabinets, dust, and the faint smell of boiled cabbage. The job was at a small research institute, one of those quiet places that existed mostly to give men with minor academic ambitions a place to nap between meetings. She had applied for fieldwork, for ocean surveys, for anything that involved actual science. Instead, she was hired as a research assistant, which in practice meant she was expected to type other people's notes, make tea, and not speak unless asked. The man who interviewed her, round-faced with a moustache that twitched when he lied, had said, "We value precision here, and discretion." She wasn't sure what he meant by discretion, but she assumed it involved not pointing out his mistakes. Her desk was in a corner, near a window that didn't open, and a radiator that hissed like a disapproving aunt. The other staff, 6 men all older, all with titles like Senior Observer or Assistant Director, barely acknowledged her. When they did, it was to ask where the ink was, or if she'd finished transcribing Dr. Hemsworth's lecture on sediment layers. She had, twice. The first version had a typo on page 7. They made her do it again. She didn't complain. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to learn. And slowly, quietly, she began to notice things. The Institute had been collecting ocean depth measurements for years, mostly from naval ships that had recorded soundings during wartime patrols. The data was considered routine, useful for navigation, not science. Most of it sat in boxes labelled miscellaneous hydrography and forgotten, but she asked to see it. The head of the department, a man who wore waistcoats with too many buttons, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Why? It's just numbers," she said. "So is a phone book. Doesn't mean it's not useful." He blinked as if she'd broken a rule by being clever, but eventually handed over a folder. That night, she stayed late. The building emptied by 5:30. By 6, she was alone. The only light in the room coming from her desk lamp and the glow of a street lamp outside. She spread the data across the table, columns of numbers, each representing a depth taken at a specific point in the Atlantic. To most people, it would have looked like a shopping list written by a drunk, To her, it was a language. She began plotting the points on a grid, marking depths with dots. Deeper spots got lower marks, shallower ones higher. Slowly, a shape began to emerge, not flat, not random. A long, winding ridge, running north to south, with a valley down the middle. She frowned. That wasn't supposed to happen. Everyone knew the ocean floor was mostly flat. A vast plain of mud and silence. This looked more like a spine, like the earth had a backbone under the water. She checked the data again, then again. She found errors, misrecorded depths, typos in coordinates. But even after correcting them, the shape remained. She tried plotting a different section. Same thing. Another ridge, another valley. She sat back, rubbed her eyes, and thought, well, that's odd. The next day, she mentioned it to one of the senior men, a doctor, Pritchard, who spent most of his time writing letters to journals about the erosion patterns of British cliffs. There seems to be a pattern in the Atlantic soundings, she said. A continuous, underwater mountain range, more or less down the centre. He didn't look up from his letter. Oh, probably just a fault line. Nothing significant. She said, it stretches thousands of miles. It's not a fault, it's a feature. He finally glanced at her. You've been spending too long with those numbers. They'll play tricks on you, like staring at clouds and seeing faces. She didn't argue. She went back to her desk. Later, she overheard two of the men talking in the corridor. She's mapping fairy tales, one said. The other laughed. Next, she'll be charting Atlantis. She didn't react. But that evening she took the data home. Not all of it, just enough to keep working. Her landlady, Mrs. Gable, found her at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by papers. You'll ruin your eyes, the woman said. And what for? No one's going to thank you, she said. Maybe not. But I'd like to know what's down there. Mrs. Gable shook her head. You and your rocks. At least the moon stays where it is. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Not yet. She just couldn't ignore what the numbers were saying. The ocean floor wasn't dead. It wasn't flat. It was alive with shape, with movement, with history. And no one was looking. The Institute had a large map of the world on the wall in the main hall, painted, slightly faded, the kind used to impress visiting dignitaries. Oceans were blank, painted a calm, featureless blue. One day she stood in front of it and thought, that's a lie. Not a deliberate one, perhaps, but a lie all the same, because underneath that calm blue, something huge was happening, and the only person who seemed to care was the woman they'd hired to type up reports. She started making her own maps, not on proper paper. She wasn't allowed that. She used old survey sheets, the backs of discarded forms, even wrapping paper from a parcel that arrived for someone else. She drew the ridge, shaded the depths, added notes in the margins. She didn't sign them. She didn't show them around. She just kept going. One afternoon, the head of the department walked past her desk and saw the sketches. He paused, peered at them, then said, "Bit of a hobby, is it?" She said, "Something like that." He chuckled. "Charming, like a child's drawing." Then he walked off, adjusting his tie as if he'd just won a point. She didn't mind. Let them think it was a hobby. Let them think she was harmless. Hobbies didn't threaten anyone. Hobbies didn't win arguments, but hobbies could wait, and they could grow. Years later, someone would ask her why she hadn't fought harder in those early days, why she hadn't demanded attention, shouted her findings, gone public. She would say, "Because no one listens to quiet women. So I let them ignore me while I did the work." And if she added just once, with the faintest edge of sarcasm, "Besides, it gave me more time to be right," well, that was between her and the truth. The war ended, and the Navy began releasing old data, sonar readings, depth soundings, navigation logs, from ships that had sailed across the Atlantic and Pacific. Most of it was meant for safety. Avoid underwater cliffs. Don't run aground. Keep submarines from bumping into things. No one thought it could be used for science. No one, that is, except the woman in the corner, with the pencil and the too small desk. She got hold of the new files by accident. Or not quite accident. She saw a box marked Atlantic Survey, restricted, left open on a senior researcher's desk while he went to lunch. She didn't steal it. She just didn't close the door properly when she walked past. Later, when the office was quiet, she sat down with it. The pages were full of lines and numbers printed in thin blue ink. Sonar echoes, time delays, depth calculations. To most it was noise. To her, it was music. She spent weeks copying it by hand. Not because she didn't trust the originals, though she didn't, not really, but because she liked to feel the data as she wrote it. Each number was a step. Each dot on her grid was a footprint. Slowly, the shape came back. The long ridge, the central valley, the symmetry on either side. But now it was clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. She began to suspect something strange. The rock on either side of the valley wasn't just similar, it was mirrored, like someone had taken a knife and split the seafloor in two, then pushed the halves apart. That didn't make sense. Nothing on Earth just split open and moved. Or at least, that's what the textbooks said. The textbooks also said the Earth was static, that continents didn't wander, that mountains formed slowly and quietly. She had read those books. She just didn't believe them anymore. One evening, she spread her latest map across the floor of her rented room. It was made from 4 pieces of brown wrapping paper taped together, covered in pencil lines, shaded depths, tiny notes in the margins. She stood back and looked at it. From a distance, it looked like a wound, a long, deep cut running through the ocean, with something rising up from the middle. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said, out loud, "Well, you're not supposed to be there, are you?" The next day, she showed a small section to a visiting geophysicist, a man from America who actually asked her opinion. She didn't hand him a finished map. She wasn't that naive. She gave him a clean, simple plot of depth readings across the mid-Atlantic. He studied it. "Huh," he said. "That's a rift valley." She said, "Yes. And the ridge on either side. Look at the symmetry." He frowned. "That's odd." She didn't say, "I've been saying that for years." She just said, "It's consistent across thousands of miles." He nodded slowly. "Someone should look into this." She didn't point out that someone already had. Back at the institute, nothing changed. The men still talked about rocks they could see, not ones buried under miles of water. They still handed her stacks of papers to file, still asked her to fetch tea during meetings. One afternoon, Dr. Hemsworth walked past her desk and glanced at her latest sketch. "Still playing with your underwater hills?" he said. She said, "They're not hills, they're mountains, bigger than the Alps." He laughed. "Well, as long as you don't expect us to believe it." She didn't reply. But that night, she added a label to her map, in small neat letters, Mid-Atlantic Ridge. She didn't invent the name, but she was the first to draw it properly, the first to show its full length, its depth, its strange central crack. She didn't shout about it. She didn't write a paper titled, "I have discovered something important." She just kept working. She knew no one would take her seriously if she acted like she was changing the world. So she acted like she was just tidying up. Like this was just another project, like she wasn't slowly redrawing the face of the planet. Sometimes she caught herself smiling. Not because she was happy, though there was a quiet satisfaction in being right, but because of how blind everyone else was. These men, with their degrees and their titles, walking around as if they understood the earth, when they hadn't even looked at half of it. The ocean covered 70% of the planet, and they treated it like a swimming pool with bad lighting. She once overheard 2 senior staff members talking about a new theory, continental drift. One said, "Ridiculous. Continents don't move. That's like saying your house gets up and walks to the next street." The other said, "Exactly. Only a madman or a German would believe that." She said nothing, but later she looked at her map and thought, well, the ocean floor is moving, whether you believe it or not. She began to wonder if the ridge wasn't just a mountain range, but a factory, a place where new seafloor was being born, pushed up from below, then spreading outward like a conveyor belt. If that were true, it could explain the symmetry, the rift, the way the rock got older the farther you moved from the centre. It was a wild idea, a dangerous idea. It meant the earth was alive, shifting, changing. Not a solid ball, but a restless thing. She tested the thought against the data, again and again. It fit. Not perfectly, nothing did, but well enough to make her pulse quicken. She didn't tell anyone. What was the point? Last time she'd suggested something new, Dr. Pritchard had told her to stick to typing, so she kept her thoughts to herself. She drew her maps, she corrected errors in the data, she made tea when asked. One day, a young technician saw her working late and asked, "Why do you bother?" "No one's going to read it," she looked up. "I'm not doing it for them," she said. "I'm doing it because it's there." He didn't understand, but he didn't laugh. That was something. The truth she was learning didn't need an audience. It just needed to exist. And sometimes the best way to change the world was to sit quietly, with a pencil, and draw it the way it really was, while everyone else looked the other way. And if that made her a nuisance, a dreamer, a woman with too much time and too little sense, well, let them say it. She had a map to finish. She finished the map in the spring of 1957 on a Tuesday. It wasn't unveiled with music or speeches. No reporters came. No professors gathered to admire it. She simply stepped back from her desk, rubbed her neck, and looked at what she'd made. It covered nearly the entire wall of her office. 6 sheets of heavy paper, joined with tape and patience, filled with lines, numbers, and shaded contours. It showed the Atlantic Ocean, not as a flat, lifeless plain, but as a landscape. Deep trenches, towering ridges, a long snaking valley splitting the ocean, floor in two. At the centre, bold and undeniable, was the mid-ocean ridge, stretching from the Arctic to the Antarctic, like a spine running the length of the sea. She didn't feel triumphant, she felt tired, and a little strange, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and had just remembered to exhale. She called it the North Atlantic Floor, a composite map based on available soundings. The title was dull on purpose. She had learned by now that if you wanted men to take you seriously, you had to make your work look boring. Excitement was for boys with new toys. Women had to be careful not to seem too eager, too sure, too certain. So she gave them facts, neat lines, clear labels, no drama, just the earth, drawn as it was. She made 3 copies, one she kept, one she sent to a research library in the States. No note, no request for feedback, just her name and address in the corner. The 3rd she left on the desk of the Institute's director, under a paperweight shaped like a tiny volcano. He saw it the next morning. She watched from her desk as he stopped, frowned, turned to a colleague, and said, "Did we commission this?" The colleague squinted. "Looks like something from the typing pool." She didn't react, but later she heard him tell someone on the phone, "Oh, just a little project from our assistant. Harmless enough." Harmless. That was the word they used when they didn't want to admit they were wrong. A month later, she attended a small conference in London, not as a speaker, but as a support staff member. She wasn't listed in the programme. She wasn't introduced. She sat in the back, took notes, and handed out programmes when asked. One session was on oceanic geology. A well-known professor from Cambridge stood at the front speaking about recent discoveries in the Atlantic. He showed a slide, a simplified version of a ridge with a central valley. He called it a fascinating new feature and said it might hold clues to the Earth's deeper movements. She recognised the shape instantly. It was her map. Not exactly. Details had been smoothed, the scale altered, the precision softened, but the structure, the symmetry, the central rift was unmistakable. And there was no mention of her, no reference, no credit. She didn't stand up. She didn't shout. She just sat there, her hands in her lap, and thought, so this is how it's done. After the talk, a few people clapped. Someone called it groundbreaking. She walked to the tea table, poured herself a cup, and said nothing. A man she knew slightly, someone who had once asked her to check his daughter, came over and said, "You see that? Amazing, isn't it?" she said. "Yes, very." He didn't notice the flatness in her voice, or if he did, he chose not to. Later, she found out the professor had seen her paper in the obscure journal. He hadn't cited it. He hadn't written to her. He had simply taken the idea, dressed it in his own words, and presented it as his insight. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. In science, as in many things, credit often went to the loudest voice, not the first one. She wasn't angry. Not really. She had expected it. She had known, from the first day she sat at that desk, that this would happen. Women's work was like wallpaper. Everyone saw it, but no one noticed it was there until it was gone. But she didn't stop. She started again. She began mapping the Pacific, then the Indian Ocean. She worked with magnetic data now too, pulling in readings from research ships. She noticed something odd. The rock on either side of the ridge showed matching patterns of magnetism, like stripes on a zebra. The stripes were symmetrical. They repeated, and they got older the farther they moved from the centre. It was as if the sea floor was being born in the middle and pushed outward, like a slow conveyor belt. New rock rising up, spreading apart, carrying the continents with it. She didn't call it plate tectonics. That term hadn't been invented yet, but she saw what it meant. The earth wasn't still. It was moving, breathing, changing. She drew another map. This one showed the global ridge system, not just the Atlantic, but the one wrapping around the globe, through every ocean. She shaded the depths, marked the rifts, added notes in the margins. She didn't send it to a journal. She didn't expect it to be published. Instead, she gave copies to a few younger scientists, ones who asked questions, who didn't laugh at strange ideas. She didn't say, "This is mine." She just said, "You might find this useful." One of them did. A geophysicist from America, working on seafloor spreading, wrote to her months later. "Your maps were essential," he said. "We couldn't have made the connection without them." He didn't offer co-authorship. He didn't suggest her name for a prize, but he used her work, and slowly, quietly, her lines began to appear in textbooks, in lectures, in scientific papers, always without her name, always as data from various sources. She didn't mind. Not exactly. She knew the truth, and the truth, once drawn, couldn't be erased. Sometimes she would look at her original map, still taped to the wall, fading at the edges. She'd run a finger along the ridgeline and think, "You were there all along. I just had to see you." And if anyone had asked her whether it was worth it, the years of silence, the ignored papers, the stolen ideas, she would have said yes. Not because she wanted revenge or fame, but because the world now knew something it hadn't before. And if no one knew who had shown them, well, that was their problem. She had a pencil, she had paper, she had eyes that refused to look away. That was enough. By the early 1960s, the ground, quite literally, began to shift. Not just underfoot, but in the minds of those who studied it. The idea that the Earth's surface was not fixed, that continents drifted and oceans opened like wounds, went from being laughed at to being discussed in hushed, serious tones. A few bold scientists started using words like seafloor spreading and plate tectonics. Papers were published, conferences grew heated, old professors clung to their textbooks, younger ones scribbled equations on napkins, and somewhere in the middle of it all, quietly, without fanfare, the maps kept appearing. Not under her name, not with her photograph, but her lines, the ridge, the rift, the symmetrical patterns were there, in lecture halls, in research papers, in the margins of arguments. The data she had drawn, corrected, redrawn, and quietly passed on had become the backbone of a revolution. She didn't attend the big conferences where men stood on stages and claimed to have solved the mystery of the moving earth. She wasn't invited. When a major journal ran a feature on the discovery of the mid-ocean ridge. It credited 3 male geophysicists and a research vessel. Her name didn't appear, not once. She read the article at her desk, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. When she finished, she turned the page and went back to her work. One day, a student from a university in Scotland wrote to her. He had found her obscure 1953 paper in a library archive. "I don't know if you're still working," he wrote, "but your map is the clearest thing I've seen on this subject. How did no one else notice this before?" She wrote back, short and polite. They weren't looking in the right place. Or perhaps they weren't looking at all. She didn't say that she had spent years being told her work was neat but impractical, or that one professor had described her maps as a woman's attempt to bring order to chaos. She didn't mention the tea she'd made, the reports she'd typed, the way she'd been ignored in meetings where her own data was discussed without her being allowed to speak. She just answered the question. Slowly, more people began to find her, not through official channels, but through whispers, footnotes, old files. A scientist in Norway cited her paper in a footnote so small it was nearly invisible. A researcher in California used her depth corrections in a study and added, in brackets, data from uncredited source, likely British female researcher, active 1950s. She saw a copy once. She smiled. It was the closest thing to recognition she'd had in years. Then in 1968, a book was published, The Dynamic Earth. It became a bestseller in scientific circles. It told the story of how the theory of plate tectonics had been born. It mentioned sonar, magnetic stripes, continental drift. It named professors, institutions, research ships. It had a whole chapter on the mid-ocean ridge. She read it from cover to cover. Nowhere did it mention her. Not her maps. Not her years of plotting data while others made tea. Not her quiet insistence that the ocean floor was not flat, not dead, but alive with movement. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf. Next to it sat a geology textbook from 1940, one that claimed the seafloor was largely featureless and of little geological interest. The contrast was almost funny. A colleague, someone who had once mocked her underwater hill project, came into her office a few weeks later. He was excited. "You've seen the new theory," he said. "It's brilliant. The ridge is where new crust forms. Can you believe it?" She looked up from her desk. "Yes," she said. "I can." He didn't notice the dryness in her voice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was too busy being impressed with science. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "I've known that for 15 years. She didn't point out that he had once told her to stick to filing when she mentioned the Rift Valley. She just nodded and went back to her work. That night, she sat in her small flat, the window open just a crack, the sound of distant traffic drifting in. On the table in front of her was a stack of letters, some from scientists, some from students, all thanking her, praising her insight, calling her work foundational. None of them had known who she was when they started reading. She didn't keep the letters for pride. She kept them because they proved something. That truth, once drawn clearly enough, could not be buried forever. It might be delayed. It might be misattributed. It might be ignored by the people in charge. But it would find its way out. And if the world wanted to pretend the discovery had come from loud men in lecture halls, rather than a woman with a pencil and too much patience, that was fine. Let them have the speeches. She had the maps. And the maps, unlike people, didn't lie. She retired in 1975, not with a ceremony, but with a small envelope containing her final pay and a card signed by the staff. Dr. Hemsworth had long since left, promoted, then quietly forgotten. The Institute had changed names twice, moved offices, hired new men with new ties and the same old attitudes. She handed in her keys, cleared her desk, and walked out without looking back. No one threw a party. No one made a speech. The younger technicians nodded politely. One asked if she'd be keeping in touch. She said, "Only if you need help reading a contour line." He laughed, not unkindly. She went home to a flat by the sea, not far from where she'd grown up. The view wasn't dramatic, just grey water, a few gulls, the occasional fishing boat trawling slowly along the horizon. She liked it that way. Nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. At first she didn't do much. She walked along the shore. She read old books. She fixed the toaster when it broke. Not because she enjoyed it, but because no one else would. Then slowly she began to gather things. Old journals, letters, scraps of paper covered in pencil marks. She didn't write a memoir. She wasn't interested in telling her side of the story. But she sorted the material, filed it neatly, and left it on a shelf, as if someone might one day want to know. Years passed. The world moved on. Plate tectonics became schoolbook fact. The mid-ocean ridge was no longer a mystery, but a chapter in geography lessons. Satellites mapped the seafloor in detail she could never have imagined. And somewhere, in the footnotes of academic papers, her name began to appear. Not often, not loudly, but it was there. In 1994, a university invited her to give a talk. Not because they'd suddenly recognised her work, but because a young lecturer had found her maps in an archive and insisted. The event was small, 20 people in a stuffy room, most of them students who'd come for the free tea. She stood at the front, not nervous, just slightly amused at the idea of being listened to after all this time. She didn't speak about injustice. She didn't list the years she'd been ignored. She talked about data, about lines on paper, about how, if you looked long enough, the earth would show you its shape. Afterwards, a girl approached her, early 20s, nervous, clutching a notebook. "I read about your maps," she said. "They changed everything, didn't they?" She looked at the girl, then out the window, where rain had started to fall. "They helped," she said, "but the sea floor did most of the work." The girl smiled. "Still, you were the one who saw it." She didn't argue, but that night she wrote the girl's words in the back of an old journal, between a tide chart and a shopping list. She never won a major prize. No medal came. No street was named after her. When a science museum opened an exhibit on ocean exploration, her map was displayed in a corner, under glass, with a label that read, "Early Interpretation of Mid-Atlantic Features, 1950s, author unknown." She visited once, stood in front of it. A guard asked if she needed help. She said, "No, I'm just looking." She didn't correct him. What would be the point? The map was there. The ridge was there. The truth was there, even if the name wasn't. She lived quietly. She kept her hair short. She wore sensible shoes. She drank tea without sugar. She never married, never had children. When asked, she said, "I was too busy watching the planet move." Sometimes people thought she was joking. She wasn't. In 2006, a biography of a famous geophysicist was published. In it, he admitted briefly that his breakthrough had relied on detailed maps produced by a woman at a British institute. Name lost to history, unfortunately. She read the passage and thought, not lost, just not handed the microphone. She didn't write to correct him, but she circled the sentence in pencil. She died in 2012, in her sleep, at the age of 95. The local paper ran a small obituary. Marjorie E., retired researcher, beloved sister and aunt, passed peacefully. No mention of maps, no mention of ridges or rifts, or the shape of the earth. But a few weeks later, a student in a geology class raised her hand and asked, "Who first mapped the mid-ocean ridge?" The lecturer paused, then said, "We don't know for sure." But there was a woman, British, worked in the 50s. Her maps were crucial. We don't have much on her. The student made a note. And somewhere, in a flat by the sea, an old notebook still sits on a shelf. Inside, among tide charts and tea stains, is a single line, written in neat faded pencil. They thought it was nothing, but it was everything.
In times when seas were yet uncharted, and horizons seemed like the edge of existence, Egypt was ruled by a king who liked to call himself brother of a brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Not because he had enough brothers to fill an army, but because he believed knowledge, like family, should never be left alone. Somewhere in the heart of Alexandria, between the bustling port and the gleaming white temples, he dreamed of building a place where all human wisdom would gather. Not that of gods or warriors, but of reason itself. The idea, of course, wasn't new. Like most brilliant ideas, it was born from greed. The king wanted a library, but not the kind that stored scrolls of taxes or slave inventories. He wanted to collect everything: Babylonian laws, Indian healing recipes, Phoenician sailors' songs, even the silly poems lovers wrote under palm trees. To achieve this, he devised a trick worthy of a carpet merchant. Every ship arriving in Alexandria had to surrender its books for temporary safekeeping. Guards searched the holds as thoroughly as if they were hunting stolen princesses. If they found a text, it was immediately taken to the library, where scribes copied it until their fingers turned black with ink. The original was kept in the king's treasury, and the merchant received a copy with the inscription, "Donated to the Library of Alexandria." Merchants, of course, grumbled. One Phoenician, whose grandmother had once recorded how to tame storms with songs, nearly started a riot at the dock. He stood waving his arms like a windmill and shouting that his ancestors had guarded these secrets for generations, and now they'd be taken like the last fig from a starving camel. But when he was handed a bag of gold for his donation, his anger melted faster than snow in the desert. So it went. Merchants' fury turned into a sly smile. Some began slipping fake scrolls into their chests with nonsense like how to turn sand into water, hoping to earn gold for empty chatter. Others hid valuable manuscripts in barrels of olive oil, unaware that guards had learned to sniff out the scent of ink even through resin. The library itself grew like the Nile in flood season. Its halls resembled a labyrinth where every turn led to a new wonder. Here lay Babylonian astronomers' tables that could predict eclipses as easily as a housewife foretold rain. There, instructions from Egyptian doctors on how to reset a dislocated jaw with a stick and rope. Sometimes odd things turned up. A scroll on growing gold from clay. The author had clearly drunk too much Phoenician wine. Or notes from a Persian poet who spent 3 days describing how beautifully a rose petal fell. The king, however, didn't distinguish between valuable and worthless texts. For him, one thing mattered. If a single handwritten word existed somewhere in the world, it had to end up here. The copying process became a craft, almost a religion. In the library's cellars, where the air smelled of lavender to keep moths away, and lamp oil, scribes worked. Their hands moved as quickly as if afraid the ink would dry before they could capture the wisdom of the ages. Young apprentices holding reed pens for the first time often stained their fingers and scrolls, while senior masters sighed like grandmothers watching their grandchildren's mischief. One such youth, Sosibius, became famous for mixing up letters in Euclid's formula and writing square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. From then on, Sosibius was made to write in gloves, and he wore them even in his sleep. But not everything ran smoothly. One day, a fire broke out in the port. Someone dropped a lamp near a barrel of oil. Flames crept toward the warehouse where fresh scrolls were stored, scrolls not yet copied. Scholars ran about like headless chickens, trying to save what they could. Someone threw a stack of manuscripts straight into the Nile, hoping water would stop the fire. Later, when the panic subsided, they fished out the soggy scraps, but the ink had bled, turning wise thoughts into abstract patterns. Then an elderly Egyptian priest stepped in, the kind who had probably been waiting for this moment his whole life. He suggested mixing ink with acacia sap, a plant growing in the desert. It turned out thick as clay and unafraid of water or time. From then on, all important texts were written with this mixture, and the priest received a lifetime supply of figs and the right to sleep in the library on a mat of palm leaves. Over time, Alexandria became not just a port, but a giant vacuum cleaner for knowledge. Merchants from distant lands, hearing that books were paid for in gold, began deliberately bringing scrolls, even if they previously only carried spices and slaves. One Greek trading olive oil hired a poet to write an ancient manuscript overnight about a hero who defeated a sea monster with a spoon. Guards believed it, took the scroll to the library, and the merchant got his gold. Later, it turned out the poet had simply rewritten the story of Perseus, replacing the sword with a spoon. But the king wasn't even angry. He decided humor was also part of human wisdom. Not everyone welcomed this enterprise with enthusiasm. In Athens, for instance, philosophers turned up their noses. What were Greek thoughts doing rotting in Egyptian dust? But when they learned the Library of Alexandria held original works by Aristotle that had already rotted from rain in Athens, their pride softened somewhat. Even Romans, usually dismissive of foreign books, sent a messenger requesting a copy of the legal code. Their own records seemed to have vanished into Senate dust. The library grew, but so did its problems. Scrolls multiplied so fast that a storage system had to be devised. At first, they were stored in jars like grain, but mice quickly learned to gnaw through clay. Then wooden shelves were built, but sea humidity made the planks swell, and scrolls curled up like frightened snakes. Finally, following a Babylonian architect's advice, stone niches with sand at the bottom were constructed. Sand absorbed moisture, and scrolls lay as if in a pharaoh's tomb. Each library section got its color: green for medicine, blue for astronomy, red for poetry, though poets were offended to be mixed with blood. Sometimes texts arrived that even the king lost his composure over. For example, a scroll in a strange language where birds and fish replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it was an Indian cipher where each bird represented a syllable, or a papyrus with a formula for eternal youth, written so small it had to be read through an ice magnifying glass. Later, it turned out to be just a wine recipe. But by then, the king had already ordered ice spectacles for the entire court. Over time, the library became more than a book repository. Scholars gathered here to debate whether Earth was flat or round, whether the distance to the moon could be measured, and whether water turning into wine was even believable. Sometimes arguments turned into fights. Once, an astronomer and a geographer nearly killed each other because the first drew a map without desert, and the second claimed desert was a myth. The king, hearing about it, merely smirked. Let them fight. While they argue who's right, we'll collect both versions. But the biggest problem wasn't arguments or mice. Knowledge, like wine, changed taste over time. Scribes copying scrolls sometimes added their comments, or worse, skipped entire paragraphs, deciding they were obvious nonsense. A philosophical treatise on the nature of the soul reached posterity with a marginal note. The author clearly drank too much. Souls can't be blue. A plague remedy recipe acquired notes like, "Try adding garlic, worked for my aunt." The king, learning of this, issued a new decree. All comments must be written in red ink so they'd be visible. Thus, the world's first standard for scientific annotations was born. By the end of Ptolemy's reign, the library had become legend. Merchants joked that if a single word existed anywhere not written on papyrus, it would still find its way to Alexandria. Once, a ship arrived from an unknown island, and the captain gifted the king a scroll woven from spider silk. It showed stars and strange symbols. Scholars spent 3 years trying to decipher it. Was it a map of distant islands or just a madman's drawing? It turned out to be a letter from Polynesian islanders who navigated by stars. But by then, the ship had long sailed away, and the captain had probably forgotten why he'd done it. So the library grew, not perfect, not flawless, but alive. It contained mistakes, deceptions, silly jokes, and brilliant discoveries. But every line, even the most absurd, reminded, knowledge isn't just truth. It's also the people who write it, copy it, lose it, and find it again. The king, perhaps, didn't know that one day this labyrinth of scrolls would burn, crumble to dust, or sink into sand. But in those years when Nile dust mixed with ink and scholars' laughter drowned out the sea's roar, Alexandria was the closest place to what people call eternity. Sometimes, though, eternity smelled of lavender and rancid oil, and tomorrow would be a new day. New scrolls. New mistakes. But that was another story. If the library's first problem was gathering books, the second was realizing knowledge doesn't always wear a toga or sit in chests. Sometimes it hides in desert sands, in old priests' whispers, or in drawings on clay shards. King Ptolemy, seeing how quickly the library's halls expanded, suddenly understood. What if somewhere far away, beyond his port, secrets lay hidden that he couldn't even imagine? Like in Babylon, where astronomers predicted falling stars, or in India, where doctors removed tumors and stitched wounds with monkey intestine thread. So he gathered the boldest, the most cunning, those who could fool even a fox if the fox could read. These people didn't wear armor or carry swords. Their weapons were bags of Egyptian linen, bottles of wine, and the ability to lie as if telling the truth. They were nicknamed collectors, though in essence, they were thieves in silk. The first mission was sent to Babylon, the city where towers reached for the sky and scholars knew more than gods. Ptolemy chose 3, Callimachus, who could memorize an entire scroll at a glance, Lysander, a master of spontaneous storytelling, and young Theocritus, who still confused left with right, but could go a month without eating if asked. The road to Babylon was long, first up the Nile by boat, then across the desert on donkeyback. The desert, as always, didn't appreciate haste. Sand got into bags, water ran out faster than promised, and at night, the cold forced them to sleep huddled like puppies. But the collectors comforted themselves. If they died, their names wouldn't be recorded in the library. and that was worse than death. When they reached Babylon, the city greeted them with the scent of cinnamon and clay. Here, knowledge wasn't stored on papyrus, but on clay tablets, durable as Babylonian officials' temperaments. To access them, the collectors devised a plan worthy of a drunk poet. Lysander declared himself an envoy of the Egyptian king bringing gifts. Callimachus, disguised as a priest, began interpreting dreams on the streets to gather followers. And Theocritus, the most useless of the three, handed out sweets made of figs and almonds to children, hoping they'd lead him to scholars' homes. Within a week, they knew everything: where astronomical tables were kept, how Babylonian sages counted years, and most importantly, that local officials hated being reminded their great city had once been destroyed. Then Lysander took a risk. He appeared at the temple of Marduk with a bag of linen, the finest in the world, used to swaddle Pharaoh's infants. "King Ptolemy gifts this to the god," he announced. "But if your priests refuse, we'll take it to Syria. Their gods, they say, have sensitive skin." The priests, of course, couldn't resist. The linen was too good to refuse. In exchange for 10 pieces of cloth, they gave the collectors a bundle of clay tablets with eclipse tables, star lists, and even instructions on building towers so they wouldn't collapse. Later it turned out the last part was a joke. Babylonians themselves didn't know why their towers fell. But the collectors didn't ask. They packed the tablets in straw-filled sacks like fragile wine and headed further, to India, where, according to rumor, doctors stitched wounds so well no scars remained. The road to India proved worse. Deserts gave way to jungles where trees clung to the sky and snakes were longer than Theocritus's patience. In one city, they were nearly eaten by tigers. In another, almost drowned in a river mistaken for spies. But the worst awaited them in the Raja's capital, a city where gold was cheaper than clay, and doctors operated so quickly, patients didn't have time to get scared. The collectors learned the Raja possessed a scroll, ancient, parchment, written in a language resembling bird tracks. It described operations Egyptian doctors considered nonsense: removing kidney stones, mending broken bones with wooden splints, even restoring sight to the blind. But the Raja guarded it like treasure, and taking it by force meant inviting the wrath of 1,000 warriors. So Lysander devised a new lie. He announced King Ptolemy had sent the Raja the world's rarest wine, actually ordinary Phoenician wine laced with a sleeping potion Callimachus learned from Egyptian priests. At the feast, the Raja drank 3 cups and fell asleep like a baby. While his servants danced and sang, the collectors sneaked into the treasury. There, among ivory and jewels, lay the scroll tied with a silk ribbon. Theocritus, trembling with fear, stuffed it under his robe, and Callimachus, just in case, hid a couple of math books. Might come in handy. But as they left the palace, they walked into an ambush. It turned out the Raja had woken up early and noticed the theft. Warriors surrounded the collectors at the city gates. Lysander, as always, began talking about friendship between nations, how the scroll was a gift from the gods, that they'd only temporarily borrowed it for copying. But the Raja wasn't convinced. Then Callimachus did what he should have done long ago. He threw the scroll into Theocritus's hands and shouted, "Run!" Theocritus ran. Through narrow alleys, past shouting traders, across a bridge over the river. Arrows whistled past, but he didn't stop. Only when the city was behind him did he hide the scroll in a staff, specially hollowed out like oars on a boat. Then he sat on the ground and cried. Because he knew Callimachus and Lysander wouldn't catch up. They didn't. They were caught. Lysander was executed for deception. Callimachus was thrown into prison. But before dying, he scratched star coordinates into the wall so someone might one day find their path. And Theocritus, alone with his staff, walked through the desert. Water ran out. Cracks appeared on his skin like on a clay pot. Sometimes he thought he heard Lysander's laughter or Callimachus's cough, but it was just the wind playing with sand. When he reached Alexandria, they barely recognized him. His cloak had turned to rags, his face was crusted with salt, and he clutched the staff like his last hope. King Ptolemy personally met him in the library. Theocritus silently pulled out the scroll and placed it on the table. Then he collapsed. Scholars rushed to the manuscript. Indian letters danced before their eyes, but they knew it was worth it. The scroll was translated, copied, displayed in the medicine hall, and Theocritus's staff was placed in a corner, a memorial to those who didn't return. From then on, people in Alexandria said, "Not all books come by ship. Some come from the desert, from jungles, from roads where those who brought them died." And every time a scribe picked up a new scroll, he remembered. Behind every line lay someone's life, someone's lie, someone's hope. But not all missions ended tragically. Once, a Chinese merchant arrived at the library, with silk, porcelain, and a scroll where birds replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it wasn't language, but music. Each bird was a note. They played the melody on a lyre, and the hall filled with the scent of flowers that never grew in Egypt. The king ordered the scroll placed next to astronomical tables. "Let stars and notes be friends," he said. And a year later, a ship from Africa arrived at the port, with a box full of black beans. "For alertness," explained the merchant. In the library, they tried the beans, brewed them in water, and named the drink coffee. Now scribes worked through the night without falling asleep from fatigue. So the collectors continued their work. Some returned with gold and glory, some with empty hands, some didn't return at all. But every mission reminded one thing. Knowledge doesn't ask permission to enter the world. It comes when sought. Even if it means deceiving a Raja, fleeing warriors, or walking through the desert with only a staff. Sometimes, though, knowledge came on its own. Once, an old fisherman wandered into the library and brought a papyrus found in a fish's belly. It showed a map of a non-existent island. Scholars decided it was a joke, but 100 years later, Columbus used the same map to find America. And Theocritus? He stayed in Alexandria, became keeper of the medicine hall, taught young scribes how to read Indian letters. And every evening before sleep, he'd take Callimachus's staff and whisper, "We brought back your scroll. Now it's your turn." But the wind never answered. The wind never answers. And somewhere in the desert, a hollow staff waited for the next hand to pick it up. Picture this. Morning. First sunbeams barely touch Alexandria's rooftops, while lamps already burn in the library's cellars. There, where it smells of lavender, dust, and something sweet. Perhaps souring wine, perhaps hope. Here, in the House of Scrolls, copies of those very secrets are born, the ones arriving by ship or brought from deserts. And here, between reed pens and ink blots, lies the quietest yet most important work in the world. Scribes aren't heroes. Their names aren't carved on temple walls. They aren't mentioned in songs. But without them, everything we know about antiquity would long ago have turned to ash. Their task is simple: transfer letters from one papyrus to another. But simplicity is deceptive. Try writing symbols you don't understand for hours, keeping your hand steady as a taut string without mixing inks. And don't fall asleep, because if the pen slips, the mistake remains forever, like a scar on an immortal's face. Let's start with morning. Lamplight flickers, casting shadows on walls. Tables covered with papyri resemble battlefields. Here and there, traces of man's struggle with letter. Somewhere the pen pierced the papyrus. Somewhere ink bled like blood. And in this chaos, silence. Only the scratch of pens, rustle of pages, and an occasional sigh from a tired master. Sometimes someone sneezes, and everyone jumps as if startled by a snake. Among newcomers is Sosibius, a youth with ink-stained fingers and eyes full of hope. He's been here only a month but already knows. Copying isn't the same as reading. Reading is like drinking water, simple, natural. Copying is like catching fish in the dark. Sometimes you catch a pearl, sometimes a stone. Yesterday, he mixed up 2 letters in Euclid's formula and wrote square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. Today, Sosibius writes in gloves and wears them even in his sleep. Beside him sits Demetrius, an old master whose fingers are crooked from work, whose eyes see letters even in darkness. They say he began writing before Ptolemy built the library. His hands move like mechanisms, every motion precise, every line perfect. But today he isn't writing. Today he's teaching. Look, he whispers to Sosibius, pointing at a scroll. Here's a dot, tiny, nearly invisible. If it's missing, the whole meaning vanishes, like saying, "The king loves bread," instead of, "The king loves bread." Imagine what happens if bread runs out. Sosibius nods, but thinks only of breakfast. Demetrius notices. "You think knowledge is about the mind," he continues. "Number knowledge is about hands, about not flinching while writing, about remembering every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. One disappears, the river becomes shallower." Sosibius nods again, but in his head, only breakfast. The day drags slowly. Sun climbs higher, lamps go out, but it's still dark in the cellar. Scribes change positions, rub stiff necks, drink water from clay jugs. Sometimes someone falls off their chair from exhaustion, and everyone laughs because laughter here is rare as rain in the desert. By noon, Sosibius finishes a page, looks at it proudly. No blots, no mistakes. But Demetrius takes the scroll, squints, and quietly curses. "Here it should be 3, he points at a numeral. "You wrote 2. "But so it's almost the same," Sosibius mumbles. "Almost the same is like almost alive," Demetrius snaps. There's no almost in science. He takes a cloth, erases the mistake, and makes Sosibius rewrite it. 3 times, until his hand remembers. After lunch comes the hardest part. They bring a new scroll, Aristotle's treatise on animals. Text on brittle papyrus, letters faded, blurred in places. Scribes frown. Reading this is like deciphering a cipher. Sosibius takes it. Hands tremble, but he's focused. Gradually, letters form words. And since the horse's soul differs from man's, suddenly he freezes. In the text, a strange word. Not Greek, not Egyptian. Looks like a typo. he asks Demetrius. The old man studies the line for a long time, then snorts. That's not a typo. It's an Indian word. Means is soul. Aristotle must have read about it somewhere. But how did it get here? Who knows those Greeks? Demetrius sighs. Maybe a merchant sold a fake. Maybe Aristotle himself got confused. But our job isn't to think. Our job is to write. And so Sosibius writes. Even if he doesn't understand. Even if his hand aches. Because that's the House of Scrolls rule. If text exists, it must be preserved. Even if it's wrong. Even if it's foolish. Even if it says the earth rests on 3 elephants. By evening, disaster strikes. One senior scribe, Philon, discovers an error in a copy of Euclid's Elements. Instead of parallel lines never meet, it reads, parallel lines meet in Ptolemy's house. This isn't just a mistake. It's a nightmare. Because now every scholar reading this scroll will think Euclid believed in miracles. And the king, by the way, isn't thrilled when his house gets compared to geometry. Philon runs between tables like a tailless monkey. Who's to blame? Who allowed such stupidity? Turns out the culprit is the newcomer, the same one who wrote about square hippos yesterday, Sosibius. He's summoned before Demetrius. The old master looks at him as if seeing through. Do you know what this means? He asks. Sosibius stays silent. It means that in 100 years, someone will read this and decide Euclid was mad, or that Ptolemy is a god. Maybe both. But I didn't mean to. Nobody means to. But mistakes happen. The question is what to do with them. Demetrius takes the scroll, tears out the ruined page, and throws it into the fire. Flames devour the words, and Sosibius feels something burning inside him too. Now you'll rewrite it, and you won't leave until it's perfect. Night. Everyone's gone except Sosibius. The lamp flickers, ink dries, and he writes. Line after line. Once, 10 times, 100 times, until the letters become what Euclid intended. By morning, he finishes, places the scroll on Demetrius's table. The old man checks it, silently nods, and smiles for the first time. Now you understand? He asks. What? That every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. Sosibius nods, and for the first time feels he's not just writing, he's preserving. The next day, the king visits the library, not to praise, to ask, why in a star chart instead of coordinates are there drawings of monkeys? It turns out one collector returning from India decided monkeys were a new alphabet. Scholars laugh, scribes sigh, and Sosibius thinks, maybe knowledge isn't just formulas and maps. Maybe it's also monkeys that accidentally made it into history. But today he won't make a mistake. Today he'll write so that in 1,000 years someone can read his lines and understand. Here was a man who knew every letter matters. Because knowledge doesn't die. It just waits to be written correctly. And tomorrow will be a new day. New scrolls. New mistakes. But that's another story. Night. Alexandria's port usually buzzed until dawn. Creaking rigging, sailors' shouts, the smell of fish and salty wind. But this night, noise turned to fire's crackle. Someone dropped a lamp near an oil barrel. Or perhaps the gods decided to test how much King Ptolemy loved his books. Whatever the cause, flames crawled along the docks like a snake across sand, swallowing ships, chests, dreams. And in the holds, between wheat sacks and fig crates, lay fresh scrolls, those not yet copied, those for which collectors died in the desert. Panic erupted in the library. Scholars, usually calm as pharaoh statues, ran about like headless chickens. Some raced to the port with buckets of water, some to the scrolls, some just stood watching flames lick the stars. Sosibius, the scribe who nearly fell asleep over Euclid's Elements the night before, grabbed the first thing at hand, a bundle of papyri with Indian healing recipes, and sprinted to the Nile. There, without thinking, he threw them into the water. If fire doesn't reach them, water will stop it, he decided. But water stopped not the fire, but the letters. Ink bled, turning wise lines into abstract patterns. When Sosibius fished out the scrolls next morning, only bird-like stains remained. Not everyone was so foolish. Demetrius, the old scribe master, instead of water-grabbed sandbags. He knew, humidity destroys papyrus, but sand absorbs moisture like a sponge. Scrolls packed in bags were carried to safety, into Serapis temple cellars, where even mice feared to rustle. But sand didn't save everything. Fire reached the warehouse storing Babylonian clay tablets. They'd have survived the fire, but not the panic. In the chaos, someone dropped the stack, and tablets scattered like dice. Now even astronomers couldn't reconstruct the eclipse table from shards. By morning, the fire died. The port resembled a battlefield. Charred planks, ash instead of sand, the smell of soot that seemed embedded in skin. Scholars stood among ruins like lost children. Sosibius looked at the wet scrolls in his hands and thought, "It's over. Knowledge has gone into the Nile like Pharaoh's ashes." But then an old man emerged from the crowd. Not a scholar, not a soldier, an Egyptian priest who used to carry water to the library and sleep on a palm leaf mat. His name was Imhotep, but everyone called him the Fourth because he was the fourth in his line with that name. He approached the wet scrolls, took one, turned it in his hands, and smirked. Not maliciously, but as if he knew this would happen. Then he pulled something like dry grass from his bag and said, "Acacia sap, smear it on ink. Won't wash off even in a flood." Everyone fell silent. Acacia sap? Desert grass? But the priest didn't explain. He simply coated ink on a papyrus scrap, dipped it in water, and the letters remained sharp as a sphinx's smile. It turned out the priest had known this for a long time. His grandfather used acacia sap for tomb inscriptions, so writings wouldn't fade over 1,000 years. But his grandfather wasn't a scholar. He was what Alexandrians called an ordinary man. And ordinary people, it turned out, sometimes knew more than those wearing togas and quoting Aristotle. Within a day, the library lived again. Not as before. Now every corner smelled of smoke and fresh paint, but it lived. Scribes worked non-stop, mixing ink with acacia sap. Sosibius, who yesterday threw scrolls into the Nile, now taught newcomers. Coat the brush twice. First layer for the letter, second for eternity. Even mice, usually delighted by chaos, hid away. Something unfamiliar smelled in the air. But not everyone rejoiced. Some scholars grumbled, "Why do we need this desert grass?" Greek ink was fine. But when a new scroll survived rain, yes, Alexandria occasionally had rain, rarely, but enough to test, grumbling turned to silence. Within a week, King Ptolemy ordered, all important texts must be written with acacia sap. Priest Imhotep IV was rewarded with a bag of figs and the right to sleep in the library. Not on a mat, but on a real reed mat. The fire became a turning point. Not just because inks changed, because everyone understood. Knowledge is fragile. It perishes not only from fire, but from water, wind, human stupidity who throws a scroll into a river thinking it saves it. Now new rules appeared in the library. No scrolls in the port without protection. All copies in 2 sets. And most importantly, if you think you know everything, you've already made a mistake. Once Sosibius asked Demetrius, "Why didn't we use acacia sap before?" The old master just sighed. "Because before the fire, we didn't know it would come." It wasn't an answer, but perhaps the most honest one. Soon, a new scroll arrived from Carthage, showing ships and strange symbols. Scribes, now experienced, coated it with acacia sap and placed it in a sand-filled niche. But a month later, they discovered ink cracked. It turned out acacia sap doesn't mix with salt, so they devised mixing it with olive oil. When the oil began to turn rancid, they added a drop of wine. Thus, a recipe survived to our days. The fire didn't destroy the library. It changed it. Now knowledge wasn't just stored. It was learned to be protected. Special jars for scrolls appeared, which could be buried in sand. Underground storage began construction, where even fire couldn't reach. And at the port, guards with buckets were stationed, just in case. But most importantly, people stopped thinking knowledge was eternal. They understood every book, every scroll is a battle with fire, water, one's own stupidity. And victory can only be achieved by remembering today's mistake, tomorrow's ash. When fire broke out again in the port a year later, this time due to a sailor's joke with a lamp, scholars didn't run like chickens. They took buckets, sandbags, and new scrolls, those written with acacia sap. The fire died within an hour, and scrolls hidden in jars survived it, like pharaohs, for thousands of years. Sosibius, no longer a novice but not yet a master, looked at the smoke and thought, perhaps knowledge isn't what's written on papyrus. It's what remains when papyrus burns. Sometimes, though, only ash remains. But even ash can tell a story. And in the desert where acacia grows, the wind whispers to old trees, "Save what you can. The rest will find its way." The Moussaïon, not a temple, not a market, not a tavern. A place where thoughts clash like waves against rocks. Some shatter into dust, others find shore. Here, in the hall with columns where drafts whispered in 10 languages, scholars argued so fiercely scribes hid ink, lest chairs fly. Here swords weren't drawn, but words broke stronger than stone. And one day, an argument began not about how many stars were in the sky, but about the shape of Earth itself. It all started with a shadow. Eratosthenes, former poet and now library head, noticed, in Siena, now Aswan, on the summer solstice, the sun shines straight into wells, no shadow. But in Alexandria, there is a shadow. So Earth is round, he declared, and we can measure its circumference. For this, he needed scrolls from the library, Babylonian angle tables, Egyptian Nile maps, even Phoenician sailors' notes drawing the horizon as an arc. He took a stick, measured the shadow, calculated, and announced, Earth's circumference, 252,000 stadia. A figure that curled geographers' toes, but not everyone applauded. In a corner sat Aristarchus of Samos, a man who believed Earth was flat as a pancake, supported by 3 elephants, though elephants, in his view, stood on a tortoise, and the tortoise on something else. He didn't shout, didn't wave hands. just placed on the table a worn scroll, Persian, written before Alexander the Great began conquering the world. It said, "Earth is God's shield, heated and flat. Whoever claims otherwise lies or is drunk." Aristarchus smiled. "Here's proof. Your calculations are dice games with gods." The argument exploded. Some shouted Eratosthenes was a genius, others that he'd drunk too much wine and now saw round wells in his sleep. Someone drew arcs, triangles, tortoises with periscopes on the floor. Others pointed fingers at scrolls, proving India knew truth while Babylon lied. Scribes, usually quiet as mice, began arguing louder than anyone. If Earth's round, like a scroll, people on the other side live upside down. No, they're like us, just their Nile flows the other way. And if we flip, will we fall into the sky? Eratosthenes didn't give up. He laid out papyri before the crowd. Cyane's shadow, angle calculation, a map where ships disappeared over the horizon like snails into a shell. But Aristarchus played his trump card. What if the shadow is light's deception? Or eyes lie? You trust paper, I trust gods. And then a scene began where even pharaoh statues seemed to cover their ears. Someone suggested testing it. Hire a ship, sail south until seeing ships disappear over the edge of the world. Others laughed. "Fools, you'll fall into the abyss. No, you'll fall when Earth flips." Third parties demanded burning Eratosthenes' scrolls to stop confusing people. One philosopher, mixing up wine with medicine, began proving Earth was a giant watermelon, and we lived on its rind. King Ptolemy, hearing of the argument, came to the Mouseion not as a ruler, but as a spectator. He sat in a column's shade, chewed a fig, and watched scholars tread the line between genius and madness. At one point, Aristarchus grabbed Eratosthenes' scroll and cried, "This is a lie! Let's throw it in the fire, and the argument ends!" The crowd froze. Fire, which recently nearly took thousands of scrolls, now could become judge of truth. But Ptolemy stood up. Not loudly, not threateningly, simply raised his hand, as those accustomed to being listened to do. "Throw the scroll in the fire," he said, "and you'll prove only one thing: fear of knowledge. I want both versions kept here. Let future generations decide who's right, because truth isn't about not making mistakes. Truth is about comparing mistakes." The crowd fell silent. Aristarchus lowered the scroll. Eratosthenes nodded. And at that moment, the argument stopped being war. Now it was dialogue. Since then, a new rule appeared in the library. If two versions of one truth exist, both must be kept. In the geography hall, next to the round Earth map, hung the Persian scroll about the flat one. Next to Eratosthenes' works, placed the watermelon philosopher's notes, though he was later expelled for trying to prove seeds were continents. Scribes began writing not just text, but comments. This is Aristarchus's opinion. This is Eratosthenes' calculation. This is a drunk poet's nonsense. But what if it's true? Arguments didn't cease. They became longer, louder, more interesting. Sometimes scholars argued so much they forgot to eat. Sometimes, so much they dropped inkwells in anger. But now behind every argument lay the thought, what if tomorrow someone proves the opposite? One day, Eratosthenes and Aristarchus sat at the same table, not as enemies, but as two ships sailing in different directions, but knowing the sea is one. Eratosthenes drew a circle, Aristarchus a square. Then they added a black dot, the place where we don't know, and smiled. Because even in argument, common ground can be found. New sections began appearing in the library, not just geography or astronomy, but debates. There lay scrolls with opposing theories, fanned out like flower petals. Someone wrote about the sun revolving around Earth. Someone, the opposite. Someone proved lightning was God's anger. Someone, that it could be caught in a jar. Later it turned out it could. Scribes, who once feared mistakes, now took pride. This scroll is a mistake, but it's important. Even Sosibius, the scribe who feared writing 2 instead of 3, began adding margin comments. Author believes Earth is flat. I think he hasn't seen ships disappear over the horizon. But maybe he's right. Demetrius, the old master, only sighed. Mistakes used to be erased. Now they're collected. But the strangest thing happened a year later. Aristarchus, still believing in a flat Earth, asked Ptolemy's permission for an expedition. "I'll prove the world's edge exists," he declared. The king agreed. Aristarchus sailed south and returned 3 months later. Not with proof of the world's edge, but with a new map. On it, the horizon was curved. "Turns out," he said, "I was wrong. But thanks to the library, it gave me a chance to err and redo." Eratosthenes smiled, not smugly, but like someone who knows. Winning an argument isn't about breaking the other. Winning is staying in the game. Since then, a tradition appeared in the Maussion. Whoever brought a new theory had to write on the scroll. This may be untrue, but I believe truth is somewhere nearby. Scribes laughed. Now even mistakes are signed like poets. But they did it, because they understood. Knowledge grows not in silence, but in argument's noise. Sometimes arguments went too far. Once, 2 philosophers argued whether thought speed could be measured. One claimed thought was faster than light, the other slower than a snail. In the end, they held a race, sitting in a corner, thinking the same thing, while scribes noted whose hand first reached for ink. The winner was the one thinking about food, but even such foolishness left a trace. Because in the library, foolishness wasn't feared. Only one thing was feared: arguments falling silent. Because silence is when everyone agrees, and agreement is death for knowledge. When a Roman envoy visited Alexandria 10 years later, he asked, "Why is it so noisy here?" In Rome, scholars speak quietly, like mice. Eratosthenes showed him the hall where 10 people shouted about the universe's shape and smirked, "Because mice fear cats, we don't." The envoy didn't get the joke, but wrote it in his notebook. Later, of course, lost it at the port. But someone found it and brought to the library. There it was, copied, with a comment. Author apparently confused mice and scholars. But what if he's right? So the library lived, not in sages' silence, but in argument's roar. Because every argument isn't an end. It's the start of a new line in a scroll no one has written yet. And beyond the Mausion's walls, the wind whispered, "Argue, error, copy. As long as there's a question, there's an answer, even if it lies in the next argument." In times when men believed women couldn't tell a scroll from a rag, and philosophers debated whether ladies had souls, a shadow appeared in Alexandria. Not the kind cast by columns at noon, but one that slipped between the library's shelves like a cat between soldiers' legs. Her name was Hatshepsut, a name she left in the past, along with skirts and perfumes. Now she was Harmon, son of an Egyptian merchant, scribe's apprentice, with ink-stained fingers and a gaze that avoided meeting others. Entering the library as a woman was as difficult as convincing the Nile to flow backward. There were no men-only rules here. They weren't needed. It was enough to look at togas-wearing scholars quoting Homer like market traders to understand. This was a place for those born with the right gender. But Hatshepsut knew, if you want to change something, start by becoming invisible. She cropped her hair, bound her chest with linen, rubbed dust on her face to hide soft features, and learned to walk so her step wouldn't reveal femininity. She also learned to cough loudly. Men did it every 5 minutes, as if proving they existed. Her first day in the library nearly became her last. She tripped over the threshold like a newborn calf and dropped a stack of scrolls. Scribes laughed. "Here you go, Harmon. Even papyrus is heavier than your brain." She blushed, but remembered her mother's warning. If you blush, you're dead. Instead, she rudely replied, "At least my brain isn't stuffed with straw like yours." Laughter grew louder, but now friendly. That's how she entered their world. Hatshepsut didn't seek glory. She came for one thing, a scroll written by her ancestors, Egyptian priestesses of Isis. It contained healing recipes known only to women, how to stop bleeding with tree bark, ease childbirth pain, heal wounds without scarring. Men's books spoke of war and gods, but were silent about surviving after it. This scroll was kept in the medicine hall, but access was limited to the chosen, those wearing white robes and shaving beards. For weeks, she observed, learned to recognize guards' footsteps, memorized when the chief keeper left for lunch, how wind rustled scrolls at noon. She noticed, every Friday, when sun hit windows, dust danced in the air, and guards fell asleep resting heads on tables. That's when she decided to act. At night, under moonlight, Hatshepsut crept into the medicine hall. Heart pounded so loudly it seemed mice could hear it. But mice, as usual, were busy, gnawing scroll edges. She found the right cabinet, shelf marked herbs and poisons. There lay a scroll tied with blue ribbon, Isis's color. Hands trembled, but she took it. Then heard footsteps. It was Zenodot, library head. Not young, not old, with a face lined like the Nile's map. He stood in the doorway, looking at her like an owl at a mouse. Hatshepsut froze. Thoughts flashed. Run, drop the scroll, shout, "It's a mistake." But he didn't move. Just slowly approached, took the scroll from her hands, and unrolled it. Read several lines, then looked at her, not angrily, but as if seeing through the lie like thin papyrus. Next morning, Hatshepsut expected punishment. She should have been expelled, whipped, sent home in disgrace. But instead, Zenodot invited her to his office, placed a new scroll before her, blank, and pointed to a chair. She sat, trembling. He wrote, "Tomorrow you start copying. No mention of yesterday, no threats, just a scroll and a chair." Later she understood. He'd known everything from the start. Her short nails, women painted theirs. Clumsy attempts to speak in a hoarse voice, lavender scent seeping through dust. But he stayed silent, because he saw how she studied complex formulas at night, erased mistakes until fingers bled, handled scrolls as if they were children. Since then, Hatshepsut stopped being Harmon. She remained in the library, but now, without mask. She wasn't greeted with applause. Some scholars left the hall when she entered. Others whispered, "A woman here?" She can't even hold a pen, but she held it tighter than many of them. Her first scroll, that very one with priestesses' recipes, was copied 10 times. It hung in the medicine hall next to Hippocrates' works. Only now it contained not just men's knowledge of bloodletting, but women's. How to heal wounds without prayers. Scribes who once laughed at her now asked to teach them reading Egyptian symbols. "How do you do it?" they asked. She replied, "Same way you do. Just look at paper. Not your neighbor's chest." But not everything was smooth. Once in the geography hall, she spotted an error on a map. A river actually flowing east was drawn west. When she pointed it out, an old geographer snorted, "A woman teaching me science?" Next, you'll say the Nile flows upward. She silently produced a scroll with caravanners' records showing, "It turns here. Because of mountains." The geographer looked and muttered, "Maybe you're right. But next time, stay silent until asked." She stayed silent. But not always. Sometimes, when scholars argued about the world's workings, she added her opinion. Not loudly, but clearly, like a drop of water in the desert, small but noticeable. Gradually, her voice was heard, not because it grew louder, but because words were precise as a knife's strike. Once a scroll arrived from India about how children are born. Men's hands trembled copying it. "This is indecent. We're scholars, not midwives." Hatshepsut took the scroll and wrote in the margin, "If you don't know how children are born, how study their illnesses?" Scribes froze. Then one of them, the boldest, added, "And she's right." Since then, a new section appeared in the medicine hall, birth and life. Not everyone accepted the changes. In Athens, philosophers wrote angry letters. "You allow women access to knowledge?" What next? Horses ruling cities. In Rome, they joked, "Egyptians love cats so much. Now cats will become scholars." But in Alexandria, rains came, scrolls got damp, and Hatshepsut knew how to dry them. Arguments arose, and she found forgotten formulas in old texts. Gradually, her presence stopped being news. Now it was normal. Once Sosibius, the scribe who once mixed 2 and 3, asked her, "Why didn't Zenodot expel you?" She smiled, because he understood. Knowledge has no gender. It has a price, and the price is preserving it. Sosibius nodded. That same day, he wrote in his diary, "Today, Hatshepsut explained Egyptian hieroglyphs to me. Turns out they resemble birds. Should have asked earlier." Zenodot died 5 years later. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but quietly like a dying lamp. Before death, he gathered all library keepers, looked at Hatshepsut and said only, "Continue." She nodded and continued. Now she herself took new apprentices. Didn't ask whether man or woman stood before her. Asked, "Can you read? Can you write? Can you err and admit it?" Those answering yes received a chair and scroll. Others left whispering, "The library smells of lavender." Strange. Sometimes, of course, those rejecting change appeared. Once an old soldier entered the hall demanding removal of this woman from sacred space. Hatshepsut didn't argue, simply gave him a scroll with a scorpion sting remedy. "Read it," she said, "and say where the mistake is." The soldier read, frowned, then threw the scroll. "All correct, but I still disapprove." She smiled. "At least your wife will live. Approval comes second." Over time, the library became a different place. Not perfect, but alive. Here people argued, erred, copied, and knew. Whoever brings knowledge is a friend, even if he or she comes from shadow. Once a ship arrived from a distant land. Captain brought a scroll in an unknown language. Scholars puzzled over it for weeks. Then Hatshepsut took it. ran a finger over symbols and said, "This is my grandmother's language. She wrote this so men wouldn't understand." It turned out to be healing herb recipes from Red Sea shores. They were copied, added to the medicine hall, and the captain, learning a woman deciphered the scroll, laughed long. "In my country, women command ships." "And here," Hatshepsut replied, "knowledge commands." When a new king came to Alexandria years later, he asked, "Why so many women here?" They showed him the medicine hall where they taught young doctors. "Because," said an old scribe, "without them, you wouldn't have lived to ask this question." The king smirked and left, but next day sent a gift, a bag of lavender. So the library lived, not in silence ruled by prejudice, but in noise ruled by truth. Sometimes rough, sometimes gentle, but always its own. And wind in the windows whispered, "If knowledge is light, then shadow isn't an enemy. It only helps see where morning begins." In those years when the library no longer smelled only of lavender and ink, but also something fading, like old papyrus in sun, a special calm reigned there. Not the calm after storm, but the calm before sunset. Aristophanes, keeper of the philosophy hall, no longer rose from the mat by the window. His hands, once writing letters straighter than map lines, now trembled like leaves in wind. They said he was ill, but his illness was strange. Not fever, not wound, just time finally catching up with one who considered it a friend. One morning, a merchant stormed into the library, not like those arriving by ship, boasting scrolls for gold. This one was dirty as if he'd eaten dust for a week, smelling of fish long overdue for disposal. In his hands, he clutched a papyrus wrapped in a rag stained like wine or blood. "This is the last," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Scribes exchanged glances. Last what? Last apple? Last breath? But the merchant stayed silent until given a bag of silver. Then he threw the scroll on the table and left like a man who sold not just goods, but conscience. The scroll was old. No title, only a barely visible signature, Aristotle. Not the Aristotle whose works already lay in the philosophy hall, but the one who wrote so even gods probably stopped thinking while listening. But this wasn't metaphysics or Nicomachean ethics. It was a text no one knew, on the soul of animals. Aristophanes, hearing this, sat up for the first time in a month. His eyes, dull as embers after fire, suddenly lit up. He took the scroll like a newborn, afraid it would crumble to dust. And so it was. Papyrus crumbled under fingers. Letters faded, barely legible in places. But Aristophanes read like one reading a dying friend's last words, slowly, painfully, hoping to remember something. An hour later, he looked up, tears on his face. Not from weakness, not from pain, from the realization the world had just learned. Aristotle wrote not only about humans, he wrote about how eagles think, why cats see in darkness, how bees find flowers, about how soul, not man's privilege, but a guest visiting all living things. Scribes standing around fell silent. They were used to arguments, mistakes, jokes about square hippos. But here there was no room for jokes. Here lay the end of one era and beginning of another. Aristophanes gave the order, not loudly, not royally, just whispered, "Copy it." In 3 days. In the library they knew. 3 days was time enough to achieve the impossible or die. Scribes nodded. They'd already seen how the old man looked at the scroll, like a farewell. Work began. Sosibius, who once mixed 2 and 3, now led the group. He chose the most skilled, those whose hands didn't shake, whose eyes still saw in darkness. The scroll was placed on a stand lit by lamps, not for warmth, but for light that might prolong the text's life. First page copied in an hour, but Aristophanes stopped them. Here's a mistake. Letter A written bolder than needed. Aristotle never wrote like this, he whispered. Had to erase and start again. Night. Lamps burned like stars in the desert. Scribes changed every 2 hours, but Aristophanes didn't sleep. He sat nearby, holding the scroll like its warmth could return letters to papyrus. Sometimes he pointed to a line, word missing here. Sometimes stayed silent, but his look said, "You didn't understand." One young scribe, nervous, dropped an inkwell. Dark stain spread across fresh text. Everyone froze. Aristophanes looked at the stain, then at the youth and said, "Now it's part of history," and smiled, for the first time in a week. By second night, Aristophanes lay down. Not to sleep, just closed eyes as if gathering strength. Scribes worked quieter, afraid to disturb his rest. But by noon, he sat up again. In his hands, the scroll. He kept reading, and suddenly froze. Fingers gripped papyrus, sweat beads on forehead. Sosibius ran over. Aristophanes pointed to a line, "This is important," and collapsed. They carried him to a tent by the library. The healer said, "He won't last till morning." But Aristophanes opened his eyes and whispered, "Till morning, we'll manage." No one asked what he meant. All knew it wasn't about him. Third day, final pages. Scroll crumbled faster than they wrote. Sometimes they had to piece fragments together like a puzzle to restore a word. One scribe, trying to speed up, wrote mouse instead of soul. Sosibius erased the mistake, but his hand shook. "If he dies while we err." Another, to stay awake, chewed tree bark, bitter as truth. Someone whispered prayers, though not believing in gods. By evening, the text was ready. Final line. "For the soul of an animal is not man's shadow, but his mirror." Scribes folded the copy, placed it next to the original. Aristophanes, hearing this, asked for the scroll. He ran a finger over letters like a blind man reading through skin, then nodded, and died. No one cried. Not because there was no grief, but because at that moment all understood. Death isn't an end. It's just a pause between lines. Sosibius took the copy, carried it to the philosophy hall, and placed it next to Aristotle's works. The original was placed in Aristophanes' coffin. "Let him take what he loved," Xenodot said. But the story didn't end. Next day, Eratosthenes came to the library. He took the copy, read it overnight, and declared, "This will change everything." And it did. Philosophers who once argued whether slaves had souls now asked, "Do ants have souls?" Doctors treating humans began studying how animals heal wounds. Even fishermen stopped considering birds stupid. They knew where to find fish. Sosibius, now philosophy hall keeper, sometimes took the scroll and thought, "Perhaps knowledge isn't what's written. It's what makes you search further." Once he noticed an error in the copy. On one page, cat was written as kitty. He didn't correct it. Let it stay. As a reminder, even in sacred text, human tremor finds its place. Years passed. The library grew, argued, burned, and revived, and the scroll on the soul of animals lay in the philosophy hall until one day a mad poet stole it. But a month later, he returned it, saying, "I thought it was a secret. Turned out it's truth." Sometimes, though, truth scares more than mystery, and in dust under the table where Aristophanes once sat, a papyrus fragment still lies. On it, one letter. Not A, not O, just a dot, like the start of a new sentence, or like a tear's trace. That night, when fire reached the port, the wind sang a song known only to ruined cities. Not a howl, not a scream. A quiet, sinister hiss like a snake slithering through ash. Ships burned like torches at a god's festival, and flames, caught by wind, already licked the library's walls. Someone dropped a lamp, or it was Caesar's gift. War rarely arrives with flower bouquets, but this time it came with fire. So Sosibius, now no longer scribe but philosophy hall keeper, stood by the window watching the sky redden. His fingers, once trembling over scrolls, were now motionless as stone. He knew this wasn't just fire. It was the end. Not the kind coming with quiet sigh, but the kind crashing in with roar and leaving only questions behind. How many scrolls can we save? He thought. How many mistakes have we already made? How many more will we make? Panic erupted in the library. Not the morning kind when scribes rush to their tables, but the kind born when time clenches into a fist. Someone ran to the Nile with buckets, someone to scrolls, someone just stood watching fire like a verdict. Sosibius didn't run. He gathered those who still believed something could be saved. Not heroes, not warriors, men with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. Take scrolls, he said, but not the easiest to reach. The ones most important to forget. First, Aristotle's works were hidden. Not metaphysics, not ethics, but that very scroll, On the Soul of Animals. Aristophanes read before dying. It was wrapped in oil, placed in a clay jar, and buried under a palm tree by Serapis Temple. If found, Sosibius whispered, let them think it's wine. Nearby were hidden Indian recipes from Hatshepsut, Eratosthenes' map. Even that very scroll with monkeys the collector once mistook for alphabet. Everything that didn't fit in jars was packed in salt bags to keep sand from erasing letters. But not everything went as planned. One scribe, young and too proud, tried to carry too much. His bag tore, scrolls scattered across the floor. He tried gathering them, but fire was already close. In the end, he dropped everything and ran, leaving fingerprints on papyri like final greetings. Another, conversely, took only one scroll, on growing gold from clay. What if it's true, he thought, then threw it into the Nile. No, still nonsense. Sosibius calmly gathered his things. Not scrolls, he knew they couldn't be carried, but Aristarchus's staff, the very one who believed in flat earth. The staff where Theocritus once hid the Indian scroll. Now it was empty, but Sosibius felt emptiness, also memory. He checked if anyone remained in the halls, found an old scribe sitting hugging a scroll like a child. Go, Sosibius said. Your hands can still write. He shook his head. My hands can do nothing now, but I won't leave. Sosibius didn't argue. Some choose to die with books, others with people. By morning, fire reached the library. Not all, part of the building survived like a tooth after battle, but enough to erase what people built over centuries. Scrolls that survived deserts and seas died from a spark fallen from sky. Somewhere burned eclipse tables, somewhere priestesses' recipes, somewhere silly notes about square hippos, all mixed in smoke like words in delirium. Sosibius stood on the shore watching the fire. In his hands, staff and a bag with final scrolls. He didn't cry. Not because there was no grief, but because grief, luxury for those still believing in endings. He knew knowledge doesn't die. It just changes form. Sometimes becomes ash. Sometimes sand under feet. Sometimes words children repeat by the well. A week later, he sailed away. Not alone, with him were those still holding inkwells. Their ship was small as a thought, but held everything left. Scroll copies, argument records, even that very scroll with monkeys. Someone asked, "Where are we sailing?" Sosibius didn't answer. He just looked at the horizon where Earth curved like an arc. Years passed. The library turned to ruins. Sand covered its steps. Wind blew last letters from walls. Sometimes tourists came to Alexandria, pointed at charred columns saying, "This was the end." But there are no ends, only pauses. 100 years later, an archaeologist came to Alexandria. Not famous, not rich, just a man believing ash could tell a story. He dug where shelves once stood, finding papyrus fragments blackened by fire. One piece was so small it could hide in a palm. On it, just 2 letters. So. The archaeologist smiled. It was enough. 1,000 years later, a blog appeared online. A young man wrote about how ancient Greeks erred in mathematics. In comments, someone wrote, "Have you tried reading their scrolls?" The man laughed. "What scrolls? They've long been gone." But that same day, he found a scan in archives, a papyrus fragment marked Alexandria. On it, a formula he sought. Signature, Sosibius, error corrected. Knowledge doesn't disappear. It just waits. Sosibius died in a small island town. Not in a tomb, not with monument, but in a simple bed with papyrus in hand. Next morning, his staff lay by the door, and inside, a scroll written by his hand. It contained no wise thoughts, just one phrase. "If you're reading this, I haven't died." That scroll was copied, then again, and again. Today it lies in the new library, the one built where the old stood. Where fire once burned, lamps now shine. Where ash once smelled, now coffee aroma fills air. And everyone entering feels, this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Sometimes, though, beginnings come with mistakes. Once a student mixed letters and wrote knowing instead of knowledge. The teacher wanted to erase the error, but then changed his mind. "Let it stay," he said. "What if it's a new word?" So the library lives. Not in stone, not in papyrus, but in people continuing to write. Even if hands tremble, even if ink dries, even if someone drops a lamp at the port. Because knowledge isn't what's stored on a shelf. It's what's passed hand to hand, like a torch in darkness. And in sand under ruins, a jar still lies. Inside, a scroll no one has found. Perhaps it'll be found tomorrow. Perhaps in 1,000 years. Or maybe it's no longer important. Because what matters isn't where knowledge lies. What matters is that it exists.